It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting through my website, emailrevealer.com. You can also go there and get an autographed copy of my book, How to Become a Successful Private Investigator. And as always, our archives are free at Spreaker.com. It's a podcast platform. You can go there, sign up for free. You get an email notification anytime we put up new content. We play repeats every single night of the week, 7 nights a week. At Spreaker.com. It's a chat room. Get involved. Our guest today, fascinating guy, Gordon Basichis. He's written several books. One of the first ones is called Beautiful Bad Girl, the story about Vicky Morgan. You might know that story. She was a mistress for Alfred Bloomingdale. She was friends with Ronald Reagan. Fascinating story there. But also, too, he's got another one here we're going to be talking about, The Guys Who Spied for China. And it's like a true story he got involved with in California, running into these guys who were doing espionage for China. In his personal life, he runs CoraGroup.com, which does pre-employment background screening, due diligence, and all kinds of company research and background stuff. Mr. Gordon Basichis, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi, Ed. How you doing?
Good. Thank you so much. And plus, too, thank you for being patient with me with all the rescheduling and booking that we had to go through this week. I had some personal stuff going on. So I really appreciate you giving me a lot of patience there. Tell the audience, who is Gordon Basichis?
Well, largely, I mean, I've gone through different stages in life, starting out as a reporter, ending up in show business for a lot of years, and then wandering from show business often to, of course, always doing books. The first book I sold, I think I was the ripe old age at 24, 25 years old, and then sold another one at 26 or 27, and then moved into show business to some degree, both doing public relations and marketing, and the occasional script here and there as well. I worked for somebody named Jay Bernstein, who was a legend in his time, crazy as hell, was a PR guy that handled a lot of big accounts, everything from the Milton Berles and the old guys to some of the newer people at the time and some of the music acts. So I did a lot of stuff for him in writing and representing different accounts for him. And then moved on from there into different things, and fate and circumstance led me to the Vicky Morgan book through somebody who said she needs somebody to write a book, and I was sort of curious and ended up sitting with her and seeing there was more than just the basic sex story that everybody had at that time made it out to be. So that led me into a whole different other world where today, of course, I do due diligence and corporate research and what have you.
Well, what is the Vicky Morgan story? That's the book you wrote called Beautiful Bad Girl.
I wrote Beautiful Bad Girl. I spent a lot of time with Vicky Morgan, sitting with her, talking to her, trying to understand what was going on. There was multiple levels on that. One was there were a lot of players that were moving the world around, power brokers, the rich and wealthy, and very influential. Alfred Bloomingdale, who was Vicky's lover for 13 years, and Betsy Bloomingdale's husband, was one of the kitchen cabinet members for Ronald Reagan. He was influential in helping Reagan become president. And before that, of course, he worked with Reagan when Reagan was governor. He was also on the Foreign Intelligence Committee. He was in real estate development. He was in all kinds of different enterprises, and Vicky Morgan became his mistress for 13 years. And as such, they developed what I like to refer to as a completely obsessional romance that caused all kinds of destruction around them, but the romance and the obsession was very real. And in the course of it, a lot of people ended up as collateral damage. That relationship largely lasted a long time. It was a valid relationship, as insane as it was. Ultimately, it killed them both. And it left all the scandal that everybody's aware of, the international scandal that 30, 40 years later still keeps coming back, and people keep on asking about it because obviously there were holes in the reportage at the time that was never satisfied. And just one of those universal stories that never ends.
How old was she when she met Bloomingdale?
She was a kid. She was like 17, 18 years old.
How old was he?
He was a man in his 50s,
Whoa.
and he sat down. He met her on Sunset Strip in one of the old restaurants. She was walking by, and he actually just called her over and sat down. And ultimately, in the course of conversation with her, said, look, I think it was the second meeting with her. He finally said, would she agree to a second meeting? She was married at the time to this guy who had his own troubles. And at the second meeting, Bloomingdale said to her, listen, I can give you anything you want whenever you want it. I'm that rich. And for somebody 17 who was out of a rural suburb of Los Angeles, this was, and a single mother, that was very appealing.
So she was already a mother and married at 17 years old.
She had her kid about 15 years old, out of wedlock, and then I believe she got 17, something like that, 17, or they were living together. And she was a long-time relationship with, once Bloomingdale came into the scene, that all went to, it dissipated very quickly.
What year was this?
It was in the 70s.
70s, okay. Things were a little wild back in those days. Okay.
About mid-70s, something like that.
Yeah. Now, was this like a discreet affair? Was she hidden away, or did his friends know about her?
It was an open secret. I mean, hidden away, put on the shelf, except when he wanted to see her. But otherwise, people after a while knew. In a 13-year relationship, you can only hide something so much. And beyond that, you don't hide it at all, and everybody kind of knew about it, including Betsy at the time, his wife, and just about everybody else in the whole Reagan kitchen cabinet and administration, on those levels, on the California levels.
So everyone there in the Reagan administration was kind of aware of this?
Pretty much. I mean, on the higher levels, some of the people. I mean, Bloomingdale would... he would arrange for a beard to escort her to a party, say a big event. He would show with Betsy, but everybody kind of knew what the story was.
Oh, fascinating. Now, was there like drug use and stuff? What other kind of scandals was involved in all this?
Well, the sadomasochism element was the key one, and that's what she sued him for, the, quote, Marquis de Sade complex. Bloomingdale had a history of sadomasochism, mainly sadism, beating hookers with a belt, and then he introduced the young Vicky Morgan to it, and she became whatever you want to call it, the slave queen, and she would oversee and supervise his whipping women with a belt or with whatever he had with him at different meeting places, at different safe houses.
Were they filming this?
I'm sorry?
Would they film this? Tape it?
I don't know of anybody filming it, no. I think he was discreet enough not to be filming it.
Do you think
he had this, he obviously had these, this predilection towards this, and it went back a long distance. It went back way before Vicky. And it was something he did. At the same time, here he was, and one of the more influential guys in the country. He was basically the fixer for a lot of very wealthy and powerful people. So, in one hand, he was careful, on the other hand, he wasn't careful at all.
Well, if he was such a fixer and involved with all these powerful people, an interest like this would be opening him up to blackmail, wouldn't it?
You would think, but, nothing really ever happened to him, which is a testament, I think, to his own power and influence, until he died, and then it became exposed through Vicky filing a lawsuit against the family for money that Bloomingdale had promised to her.
And did she prevail in that lawsuit?
Ultimately, she did. It was a group that became Showbiz Pizza, and he had promised her, I forget how many shares and part ownership, which was probably at the time $250,000 or something, and she ultimately won that. She didn't win anything like where she had, what would be equivalent to alimony. When she filed suit, it was equivalent to the Lee Marvin, Michelle Lee, which was the first palimony payments. So she filed under that. Ultimately, she lost the palimony suit and won the suit where she was awarded X amount of dollars for her interest in showbiz pizza.
Now, in the litigation, did she mention any other celebrities or famous people we would know that also were involved in this kind of activity?
She didn't really. I mean, she kept most of it to herself her whole life. I mean, and, wisely so, until maybe the end. But, it was basically his play. It wasn't like an Epstein thing where you had a whole circus of different people that were involved. It was Bloomingdale, and Bloomingdale ran the show, and Bloomingdale did what he did. And it was kept within the confines of his own circle, so to speak.
Now, how did she die?
She was beaten to death with a baseball bat, and a man named Marvin Pancos was convicted of it. Pancos was a longtime friend of hers, not the most stable sort, and he did get convicted of it, and he was sent to prison. He developed AIDS. Marvin was an avowed homosexual. He developed AIDS in prison, supposedly, and then he died soon after, died in prison, actually.
And what was his motive?
And whether he was the one that actually killed her or opened the door for the people who did kill her remains always a question to different people.
What was the described motive for him to do this?
Basically, the motive, I mean, what he claimed was he was trying to relieve her of any burden because she had hit the end of the road, so to speak. None of it made sense in that level. I mean, it made sense on a very obscure level, but there were so many other motives involved. There was things that she could say potentially about other people, not about government. Everybody goes, oh my God, it was government. No, it's not about government, but there were other people who, say, had monetary interests, fiscal interests through Bloomingdale, and with Bloomingdale, they could have been embarrassed, and especially in going back into what was 1982, which was even more distinctive in terms of condemnation than, say, with the Epstein version of it, which, of course, he didn't end up too well. So at that point, I mean, she had a lot of risk with different people that were afraid that she would open her mouth or she would create all kinds of embarrassment or possibly ruin to them.
And so with Marvin Pancos was the name?
Marvin Pancos, yes.
Pancos. Now, is he still alive today?
He died from AIDS and
right, you told me. I'm sorry.
Prison, yeah. He was sentenced to, I forget, I think it was 25 to life or whatever, and I think he made 8 or 10 or something before he died.
And his version of the story was that he was putting her out of her misery by beating her to death with a baseball bat.
That was what he said. I mean, he apparently, whatever the act was, he did. And then he went down to the McDonald's, got a hamburger, ate the hamburger, and then went over to the police station and confessed.
But now you think that he opened up the door and let someone else in to do this? Is that what you're saying?
I think there's a reason. Other people have mentioned it as well, that maybe he didn't have it in him to be the one. And the autopsy report being what the autopsy report was, it was very precise, the way she was beaten with the baseball bat. So there's some question to who ultimately did it.
And you believe this could have been associates of Bloomingdale?
I don't even think it's associates. It's hard to say. I mean, it all got lost in the shuffle. And what I like to point out to this is it was the first time where it became a huge media circus, or not the first time, but one of the times that really opened up the new wave of the media circus that we experience today. And people ran around looking for supposedly video sex tapes of different people in the Reagan administration and different sexual orgies with either Vicky or other people. And they ran around, and there was claims that these tapes existed. Nobody ever found them. But the media ran around this mad circus looking for them. And once it was discovered there were no sex tapes, or they couldn't find the sex tapes, the whole thing went away, and anything that was substantial in terms of like money laundering, malfeasance, any kind of other thing, just dissipated along with it.
And this would be money laundering through the pizza chain?
It was money laundering through a lot of different things. I mean, a lot of these people had multiple operations and offshore companies and shell corporations and what have you. And, nobody looked into anything. I mean, as they don't today either, for that matter. I mean, it's rare you see the Panama Papers, you see stuff like that. But overall, no. I mean, it's too complex for people to grasp. And at that point, whoever painted the picture, meaning, the sex tapes and everything, got everybody all hyped up on that, which is, a primary thing. And then once that dissipated, then the whole case, nobody looked any further.
I got to pick up this book. I wasn't aware of a lot of the stuff you're telling me right now. Now, would this be drug money laundering?
I mean, well, there was all kinds of possibilities. Drug money would be included in it. Other things could be included in it. I mean, people laundered money. Today, there's the AML, the anti-money laundering aspects of things where people are more on top of it. Not that it doesn't happen. I mean, the Panama Papers opened up a whole bunch of people that were dignitaries, were government officials, were leaders of different governments, and their shell corporations and their laundering operations or potential laundering operations. And this was just, a few years ago. And then behind that was the Paradise Papers, which was similar. And, this is in an era when things are a little bit easier to detect and hunt down and find, although it's by no means easy because it is still complex. Back then, you could do a lot more and get away with it without any problem.
Now, you mentioned she had a child. Does anybody know where this child is today?
I really don't know. I assume he lives in the L.A. area someplace.
And how did you become involved in this?
Oh, man, at this point.
Yeah, I'm sure. But how did you become involved in this to write the book on this story?
I had a friend who was a producer friend who knew her from back when, and she had filed the lawsuit, and the lawsuit was failing, the initial lawsuit for palimony. And then people were coming at her every which way to appear to do this and that, which she did not want to do. To her credit, she was not going to exploit it in a big way, but she did want to do a book to tell her side of things or whatever. And he put me together with her at a point where she discreetly wanted to divulge what she had. At the same time, I've said to people, she knew different points on the map or dots. She didn't know how to connect the dots because, she had signed off on a lot of paperwork and stuff that was Bloomingdale's that, was of questionable authenticity, in terms of shell corporations and what have you.
So Bloomingdale was using her name to set up corporations?
Bloomingdale was in the information business. Bloomingdale, to his credit, he was the founder of Diners Club, and nobody had any kind of credit card company at the time until Diners Club. But with Diners Club, not only did you have the credit card company in the business itself, but you also had a way of tracking people, their habits, who they were meeting with, how they were meeting, where they were going, because they were charging on the card. Now, today, you're a PI, this is commonplace, that people will track your credit cards and the rest of it to see who you went with or where you went, where you had dinner, and then it's easier to put together who you had dinner with and maybe what you talked about. It's one of the key chain links to a bigger picture. So he had that business, and besides Vicky, who he would put out to different people in the world who were dignitaries or influential people, there were other people who I met with, women who I met with, who also engaged where he would offer them different money and to engage in pillow talk with different people around, in either the country or around the world, either domestically or globally, who were of influence, and he was collecting information. So he was early on in an information business in what at that time was probably a primitive means of collection, where today it's gotten a lot more sophisticated.
Oh, yeah, for
today
the time. For the time, that must have been a gold mine to have that, and to have
he was
exclusive.
A broker. Bloomingdale as a fixer was the fixer for some very powerful and important people in this world. And as such, he was not looked upon with a lot. A lot of them looked at him with relative disdain. However, because he had the name Bloomingdale, he was given more of a pass than most people would get in that position because he was a scion of the Bloomingdale family. even though he didn't have much to do with the actual department store. His father and his uncle, I believe, were the ones that had to do with the department store.
Now, you said that he would put her out there, like he would prostitute her?
Yeah, well, I mean, the game, there was a game, and the game was she'd run off and jump the reservation and go get with somebody else, and sometimes through subconscious direction or whatever, or he'd introduce her to people. Yeah, he would introduce her to different people, and whatever happened. Now, I mean, part of their thing was she would jump the reservation and he would chase her. It was almost like high school, but high school, if you can imagine, among the more rich and powerful people in the world on a very severe basis. So in high school, if your girlfriend runs off and you got to go chase her and she makes you jealous and does all this kind of stuff, she usually runs off to where? To the bowling alley, the drive-in, or whatever it is today that somebody goes to. With her, it was international hopping. She was a lover for a long time with Bernie Kornfeld, who was notoriously with the first mutual fund in the world, which at the time was worth over $1 billion in 1960s, early 70s money, which is a fortune. And he got taken down by one Robert Vesco and a few other people, and ultimately did time in jail for it. But when his heyday, when he was living large, he was also one of Vicky's lovers.
Now, when you were meeting with her and talking to her, did she have understand the seriousness of the information she possessed and the danger she was in?
No. Until I got into it with her, then it sort of became clearer, like I say. How to phrase it. I mean, basically, like I say, she understood the dots. She didn't know how the dots connected. When the dots connected, which was what I was doing, because I'm sitting there listening to this thinking, I'm listening to I was initially thinking I'm going to listen to a story about a younger woman and an older man in the May, September, whatever it is, relationship, and all their foibles and the S&M stuff and the play acting and all the rest. And then I'm hearing about how they're moving different stuff around the world in ways that she didn't really totally understand. So once the dots started to get connected a little bit better, she understood she was in a lot deeper than she realized.
Now, what about yourself? Did you have any hesitation then in going forward with this?
Yeah, it was a concern. I mean, the story was too good not to leave alone. At the same time, it was definitely a concern.
Did anybody ever reach out to you and say, hey, Gordon, we'll get your job over here. Just look the other way. You don't want to do this.
Well, it was more the other way, which is, attempts at intimidation at different points, especially afterwards when she was dead and I had all the information. Okay,
can you describe that? Share that with us?
It's not really much I want to share there. I mean, there's just the usual thing, and people that were friends of mine and people in different places who were also happened to be in high places who happened to know said, you better watch yourself. Yeah. I mean, and this is not a good place to be. And I had help from different people, and over time, I mean, it dissipated, and that was out.
Fascinating story, Gordon. Anything on the Vicky Morgan story that I haven't asked you that you want us to know about?
I just think it's an interesting phenomenon, and it's something that's just insane for 40 years, and people keep coming back to it. They look at it, they examine it, they get it right, they get it wrong, and look at it with different eyes over time as the mores of the country change, the social mores and all that. At the time, I mean, doing what she did was instant condemnation. And then, of course, you had 50 Shades of Grey, and it wasn't instant condemnation anymore. And now you have a situation where, people are looking at things and trying to issue them in socio-political terms, and sometimes you just can't explain obsessional insanity. You just can't, and what makes it tick and how it makes it tick. And what is a legitimate romance or love affair, because it's sometimes not just two people on a wedding cake, as we've discovered over the years.
Anything suspicious about Alfred Bloomingdale's death?
I don't know. I mean, there's rumors of different things, but he died of cancer ultimately. So, and to speculate would have been a little bit more, than it is. But Alfred had his own enemies. He had his friends, and it's like in anybody in that world, you're going to have enemies, you're going to have friends, and you're going to play accordingly. It gets nasty. It's hardball, and most people don't understand what hardball entails at that level, and people just aren't playing around. It's more than just foul words at that point.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Okay, the book is called Beautiful Bad Girl. It's a story of Vicky Morgan. It's written by Gordon Basichis. Gordon Basichis, you can find him at his website, coragroup.com. Again, he's written several books. When he comes back, we're going to be talking about the guys who spied for China. If it's half as fascinating as the Vicky Morgan story, we were in for a treat. We're talking today with Gordon Basichis. You can find him at coragroup.com, which is where he does background investigations, pre-employment screening, what do you call it? Corporate research, I was going to say corporate espionage, but corporate research, business research on foreign companies, all kinds of great stuff, international research. Gordon Basichis, the coragroup.com. We were just talking about his book, Beautiful Bad Girl. And if you caught a bit of that, man, it's an incredible story. You can find that up on Amazon. It's a story of Vicky Morgan, who was dating Alfred Bloomingdale. And Bloomingdale was in the kitchen cabinet there with Ronald Reagan. You got a little bit of everything in that story, but we're going to be talking about now another book he wrote, The Guys Who Spied for China. So, Mr. Basichis, tell us, what is The Guys Who Spied for China about?
This is a book I wrote as a Ramana Clef, a fiction book, and it was quarterfinalist in the Amazon Breakthrough Fiction Awards of the year. I think it was 2009. But it's based on my true experiences. It's funny because the world, the knee bone's connected to the thigh bone, so to speak, and this Vicky Morgan experience left me in the middle of all kinds of craziness and different things. And like I said, there was different threats, there was different elements of, what do I do, how do I do it, and all the rest. I wasn't the most favored guy in the world at that point. And I met a certain gentleman who was very high up in government, among other things. And all of a sudden, he had come to me through different people. I met him at a party, and there were third-party people. There were people that he knew and I knew. They were his neighbors, but I knew. And he started asking me different things about him and taking me to dinner, and I'm wondering, what's this big romance about? Finally, one night, after a long story to cut to the chase, he told me that he believes that third-party person was one of the people, and the third-party person was an American who had gone through all kinds of things during the Korean War, and he and other ones who were prisoners had been turned by the Chinese and were working different espionage deals when you still had the bamboo curtain in the early 80s or 70s, really, the 60s and 70s and 80s. So you didn't have open trade as much. And these people were the ones that were building different companies that ultimately, over time, had developed legitimacy in the United States. And as such, they were able to garner different technology and different things for weaponry and advanced elements of technology and give it to the Chinese. So he ran this by me one night while I was sitting there and said, look, I mean, you know who these people are. I could use your help. He says, I know you're street smart, but I've been down every street in the world. So if you want to see how this game is really played, this is your chance. So who can resist? After all, you can only die, So I ended up with him through from 83 to about 88, 89 intensely, and then off and on again until about 96. And working with him as his chief cook and bottle washer, working with different units, different teams, although I was his person privately, and uncovering Chinese espionage elements and habits that you'll see if you look at the newspaper reports back in the 80s and 90s. A lot of those headlines related to this, for want of a better word, investigation. Needless to say, it was pretty insane. It got violent at times. It was pretty volatile. And there was headlines that started to come out in the days of what's his name, Judge Webster, who was first head of the FBI and then head of the CIA, and he would make these announcements and who was caught and where they were caught and all the rest of it. So it was like what I did for my summer vacation for 10 years of my life. And it was pretty intense because we're seeing it today. The people I worked with in the immediate sense were some of the group, and there was a larger group who were warning people, you better really watch how you open up China and what you do, and that they could be stealing our technology. They could be doing all the things you read in the headlines today. At that point, of course, nobody saw it as an opportunity. Money went out over sensibility. Greed was a big factor, and a lot of it was ultimately ignored. As a friend of mine who wrote a book on this, who wrote a book about Chinese espionage methods and was part of the government himself, he said he was asked into a congressional hearing in 2000 where they asked him what are the dangers, what are the things we're looking at in the years to come. And he says, I outlined for him in 2000, and he said, thank you so much, and we'll call you back if we have any other questions. And he said, they never call me back. So now, of course, you see it every day. You see the trade war. You see the rest of it. You see all these disclosures about how technology is being stolen, how weaponry has been stolen, and all the rest. So early on, this was the diagram of how they were operating, which initially was through disaffected Americans and disaffected Europeans who were essentially spying for China. And then, of course, it moved in and morphed into the Chinese themselves coming here and developing a more sophisticated network.
Okay, this is fascinating. Okay, now your friend.
Yeah, it was cowboys and assholes, and it was cowboys and Indians in a certain way, and a lot of it, from my end of it, besides other places I went, took place a lot of it in California, because California, needless to say, is a big technology center, yeah. And as such, it took place both in Los Angeles and on. Up in the Northern California in the Bay Area. It was a fairly sophisticated program, because what they did was they would start different companies right after the war, and these companies would gain legitimacy, and they would bid on different projects for the government, and they would develop different technology, and it would be shared with the government, and then it would be later shared with the Chinese. And it was going on a long time until by accident it was uncovered, because there's a different methodology, at least back then, and even now, in Chinese espionage compared to, say, the Russian or Soviet espionage. The Russians would gear in on one person. They would gear in, they cultivate the person, they take them to lunch, they do whatever, and they would try to work that person until they could get them to turn in some way. The Chinese method, or as somebody described it, the Russians would have a submarine that would come in stealthily in the middle of the night, and one boat would come in, and they would grab buckets of sand, and they'd return to the submarine. The Chinese method is such they would send 1,000 people on the beach, and each would get a grain of sand and then return to the native land. So it was a different method, and it was the same way with how they would approach people. They approached whoever they did, willy-nilly, helter-skelter. And as such, if somebody went for it, they went for it. If not, it was no big day. So, ironically, the person I worked for was, because he was a scientist, literally a rocket scientist, he was a target. And they would come to him, and they would try to cultivate him, and he would act like he wanted to be cultivated. And it started the ball rolling, and it led to all kinds of task forces and all kinds of other things. And like I say, the headlines you saw through the 80s and 90s, a lot of them stem initially from this venture.
Okay, a couple of questions. The guy who recruited you, and he said he was a scientist, now was he working for the government, intelligence agencies, or for private industry?
He did both, really, but no, he was like one of the old Cold Warriors, started out in the OSS back when, under Vannevar Bush, who was science and technologies in the OSS, and then migrated to a bunch of other things. And his area of expertise, besides being a lawyer, was radio. And when I say radio, I mean like microwave technology, extreme low frequency ELF, as they know it, extreme low frequency pulses, microwave technology, radio transmission, anything that would have to do with either, a lot of it had to do with communication in space, a lot of it had to do with weaponry, communication with the submarines at that time. All that was wrapped into what would be loosely called radio.
Yes, I just had a guest on recently did the same thing. He was telling me about working with microwaves for I think it was the Navy, naval intelligence. I remember I made a joke about microwaving popcorn. I'm going to have to go back and look back and see if I'm connected to the story here. Now, you mentioned...
the only trouble is, or not the trouble, but the thing is with a lot of the microwave technology, which has really not been released even now, and it's 20, 30 years, is that not only would the popcorn get cooked, but so would the person holding it.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned, too, that they would form companies and get government contracts. Now, everyone thinks that, well, if you get a government contract, they vet you out and they do all kind of background checks on you. There's a federal background check, all that kind of stuff. Did you see that experience or no?
Yeah, except that people were relatively clean. I mean, nobody was looking at them for their connections anywhere. A lot of them were veterans. Some of the people that were the basis for this were like down flyers who were captured, had been wounded and injured. And I hate to use the Manchurian Candidate, but along those lines, I mean, people were brainwashed. People were, turned towards the communist ideal and then sent back here. And there was a fair amount of them. I mean, it wasn't legions of them, but there were like in the dozens, I guess.
Yeah, I was going to say, how many foreign agents were involved in all this? Just in California?
Well, you had the Europeans, some of them were sent here. I mean, even like, at the time, like, say, Nicaragua, was going on, and the Sandinistas, which everybody was aware of. But everybody was aware of either the Sandinistas or the ones that were roughly pro-American, Republican, whatever they were. But there was also a third element, and they were the Chinese down there that were supposedly fighting against the Sandinistas, who were Russian-based, Soviet-based. And that element was comprised of Europeans and the Americans that we're talking about, and they were basically, they were much more pro-China. They saw it through more Maoist ideology than they did through Marxist ideology, or Lenin's ideology, really, So they were much more into that and saw China as the future. And to some degree, they weren't wrong. I mean, China did emerge as the world power, and Russia did subside to a great degree, but they did it in nefarious and traitorous ways.
Wait, you're saying that during the Sandinista revolution, that the Chinese had European mercenaries down there who were trying to convert the Sandinistas to Maoist?
They weren't really mercenaries. They're just, odds and ends people that were there. I mean, one guy we knew who was supposedly a priest, right? And a priest in some sect that had nothing to do with nothing. It's his own thing. It is registered, the group. But anyway, he was down there, and he was supposedly a homeopath. And what was decided is his homeopathology was basically administering to the wounded Sandinistas and essentially killing them. Poisoning them, whatever.
This is fascinating. I've never heard any of this before. Now, you mentioned...
No, nobody does. I mean, but I say to people, like you're a PI, so you would have some understanding of this. Yeah. I say to people, when you watch the cable news or you watch anything, you're looking at 3 or 4 data points with anything. That's what you're getting fed. When you're dealing with the world and you're dealing on these other levels, you're dealing with maybe 50, 100 data points, and you're trying to figure out what they all mean. And it's a very different puzzle once you have 50, 100 data points. It's one thing you have 2 or 3 data points, and you believe that's the way the world is running. But it's like having a pair of deuces in Texas Hold'em and believing, I'm going to win, You might have missed about 40, 50 different points of value, And that's, a large part of how it works. That's why I get paid to do what I do today, and other people get paid as well.
And you mentioned, too, when you were talking before, that there was violence involved in California?
Yeah, there was violence involved everywhere. I mean, there were shootouts, there was other things. I mean, I write in the book. I mean, here's the things I wrote in the book. There was a large building. It was like a square building in, I forget the name of it right now, in San Francisco, and it burned to the ground. In the course of it, I think 9 people died or something like that at night. And I can't remember the Bayberry building, I think it was called. I can't remember, but it's in the book. Anyway, in the course of that, they chalked it off as an illegal fireworks factory that blew up, which is kind of absurd, but the press, being the press, bought it. And as such, it was actually a shootout in there between the government people and the bad guys, because they were manufacturing illicit weapons. A lot of the weapons that everybody said, like the assault rifles that came from overseas, no, they were made here, a lot of them. So that was, because it's nothing to make an AK-47. I mean, you could do it in metal shop for all you know. So you had that there in the Bayberry building, and then you had a similar incident, I think it was in Albuquerque, where the building blew sky high, literally, and the head of the fire department, I mean, it was in the news. I mean, the building burned. He said, they told me it was a fireworks factory, illegal fireworks, but boy, I don't think so, because the bricks were flying like 200 feet in the air or something like that. And then there was a third incident like that in, I think it was Albany, New York, somewhere upstate New York, I think it was. And, I mean, this was going on, and, they were making these weapons and selling them to whoever, to different gangs, to different things. They weren't imported. They were made here. I mean, it's nothing to make these guns, and as such, they were selling them, and they raided the place, and it ended up in a shootout a couple of times.
Gordon, I asked you before if you had any problems telling the story about the Vicky Morgan. What about writing this book? Did anybody come to you and say, hey, Gordon, you can't talk about this?
No, because there was a lot of people that had interest. I wrote it as fiction. I wrote it as a roman à clef because basically that's what I needed to do. That's how I had to do it. And I was more than happy to accommodate that. I mean, what are you going to do? Life is what it is. And basically there was a lot of people who did have an interest in seeing this story come out in a certain way that gave an overview to a lot of things.
When you were getting paid for this work by this scientist you mentioned, this microwave scientist guy, and you're getting paid somehow, how were the checks coming through? Like from a front company or a government agency?
I can't really get into that. Okay. But I mean, it was legitimate. Whatever he gave me, I paid on,
Yeah, I got you.
But largely, I mean, it was a learning experience for me. Yeah. It moved me over into the business I'm in. I mean, he passed away in 1996, and, it was pretty much over by then. And it had just followed, I think it was in 93, the first World Trade Center bombing, where they blew it up but screwed it up, and I forget what they did. They did some damage, but it wasn't anything major, especially compared to 2001. And, so that was around that period. He was passing away. He died somewhere near there. And there I was. And I figured, okay, what do I do? Here I am, all dressed up, no place to go. And I ended up ultimately opening up my business with a business partner. And we've been in business for 16, 17 years now. And we went from employment screening back to due diligence, corporate research, business research, business intelligence, and all the rest of it. Which a lot of that today is private anyway. I mean, today the government has limited resources, and a lot of it gets farmed out to private people to start with. Not that we do it with the government, but I have friends that do. I'm sure you may as well. And, it's a big world of information gathering. Our business basically right now is if a company wants to merge with another company or wants to establish them as a vendor, or in some way wants to do business with them, we check them out to make sure they're above board, the money's not coming from illicit sources, there's no malfeasance, the people aren't total nut jobs that have done time in prison, all the things that would give somebody a reason to back off from a deal. And then, of course, one of the things we're doing right now, speaking of China, is a lot of companies who realize that the monopoly that China has on critical materials is causing all kinds of trouble. They're looking for alternate sources in the long term for critical materials for their supply chain, so we're helping them with that. They'll come to us and say, we know a company in Estonia that's making these kind of widgets. Are they able to ramp up? Can they deliver? Are they solvent? And are they good to do business with? And then we'll start looking into it.
Yeah, we're talking about corragroup.com, CORRA group.com. And we're talking to Gordon Basichis. Gordon, I really appreciate that. I really enjoyed this conversation, my friend. I really did. First, we're talking about the beautiful bad girl, about Vicky Morgan, and then he told us about this Chinese espionage deal he was working on with the guys who spied for China. Gordon, what do you want to leave us with? I got like 1 minute.
I think the best thing to leave you with is if you look at the headlines today about China and its espionage efforts, and you look at some of the stuff in the book or other people's books for that matter, back then you'll see a reflection and an echo of the same thing being said over and over again. It just depends when people decide to get the memo that maybe you got to approach it differently. Look, China's going to be a long-term partner, and it's not that you're going to destroy China or have a whole hissy fit, but you have to deal with it a little bit differently than it's been dealt with for the last 30 to 40 years. 30 to 40 years. I mean, you just got to approach it differently, and I'm not the only one that said this by any stretch. There's many, many people in government, outside of government, who are Chinese experts that say the same thing.
The guys who spied for China, check out corragroup.com and also GordonBasichis.com, where he talks mostly about his books and his writing and stuff like that. Gordon Basichis, thank you so much.
Hey, you're sure welcome, Ed. You take care.
Good night.